Okay, let's start. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you for the second day of the conference. And it's an honor to have Brad Armour Garb here in Trends in Logic, in Mexico City. So you know how this goes on. You have around an hour and then the Q&A. Thank you for joining us.
Además, prefiero sentarme, sitting. So, thanks, first of all, to everyone, especially to Thomas and to you, to Luis, for arranging the conference and for inviting me to talk. It's really nice to be here. Before I get started, just one thing. I'm not great with PowerPoint, so if something screws up, just tell me, and just say like something. Okay. In this talk, I'm going to advertise a non-nominal, sui generis understanding of certain forms of higher order quantification. So what I'll be doing is stuff that's based on work by A.N. Pryor that James Woodbridge and I have been developing. And yeah, I'm excited for your feedback. Some of this is very new, so I'm interested to see what you have to say. So just because I know that either people are not super familiar with non-nominal quantification or it's something that they haven't thought about for a long time, I'll give a refresher on non-nominal quantification soon. But just briefly, just as a reminder, for non-nominal quantification, the use of quantification is non-nominal because the sentential variables and the predicate variables that I'll explain don't function as nominal symbols taking entities as any sort of values. I just want to watch the time. As a result, the quantifiers governing them do not range over any domain of entities. Moreover, the quantification is sui generis because, as I'll show, the mode of generalizing is not to be explained in other technical terms, but instead, it can be interpreted directly in a natural language. Okay, so what I aim to show is that my account serves as the basis for an interesting form of deflationism about both truth talk and property talk. And I'll explain what those are in a bit. And I think that this approach improves on standard accounts that attempt to accommodate the operation of variables and quantifiers, both for sentence position and for predicate position, as a means for capturing the expressive roles of those forms of talk. So to start, let's get clear on those expressive roles. Truth theorists of any sort, whether they're inflationists or deflationists, typically hold that truth talk, by truth talk I mean that fragment of discourse that includes the predicates is true, is false, and cognates, is indispensable. And they say that it's indispensable in the following sense. We need to use those predicates in order to express our commitment towards or against claims that we can't commit towards or against directly. Since these alethic predicates are said to be required for performing these expressive roles, and I'll tell you what they are, they're said to be indispensable. Now, deflationists about truth talk go a step further, and they maintain that these expressive roles are the raison d'etre for having the truth predicate in the first place. Now, there are lots of issues that are metaphysical and conceptual regarding whether you should adopt deflationism or not, and I'm not going to bother with any of that stuff now. I've argued for deflationism previously, and I've done a lot of that. But the most important thing to recognize for deflationism is that the view is that truth talk merely plays an expressive role rather than playing any sort of descriptive role. Now, akin to the deflationism about truth talk, there's also what's called property deflationism. Property deflationism makes claims about property talk, which involves the ways that the word property and its cognates, like attributes, features, etc., function from within a discourse. On the property deflationist view, property talk's expressive role is the raison d'etre for having it in a language. Now, one motivation for property deflationism is property nominalism. Property nominalists deny the existence of properties, but they might accept the existence of other abstracta. Like they might accept that there are sets or classes. They just don't accept that there are properties. Okay, so I want to get to the expressive role. So we'll start with a question. The question is, how does adding a truth predicate to a true free language extend the expressive capacity of the language? In other words, why do we need to bring in the truth predicate in the first place? The answer that deflationists give is that truth talk enables us to capture something that is typically thought to be inexpressible in a natural language. What we might call this quasi-formally a quantified sentential variable string, what I'll call a QSV. And for an example of a QSV string, consider 1 on the handout. For all p, if the oracle says that p, then p. Now, the problem with 1 is that if we try to interpret 1 in English in terms of first-order quantifiers and the English object variable it, all we get is the ungrammatical string 1 asterisk on the handout. Everything is such that if the oracle says that it, then it. Now, note that 1 is also ill-formed because the p in 1's consequent is in sentence in use position rather than in a mentioned or nominalized sentence position as it is in its antecedent. Well, to avoid this problem, so you can't capture 1 in a natural language like English unless you bring in something like the truth predicate. So to avoid the problem, deflationists contend that truth talk is governed by the truth schema, which is TS on the handout. In TS, P is a sentential variable, bracket P indicates some nominalization. For example, something with like that or quotation marks of the sentence that goes in for P. Now, these equivalences enable truth talk to capture generalizations on sentence in use position with first order quantification, and that's illustrated in 1T on the handout. For all x, if the oracle says x, then x is true. In 1T, the object variable x covers bracket P in TS. More colloquially, 1T yields 1T prime on the handout. Everything the oracle says is true. Considering cases like this, deflationists maintain that the truth predicate provides a first-order surrogate for the sort of logical device indicated in 1 by for all P. And they claim that this is the central feature or function of truth talk. Now, that's truth talk. Property talk also plays an expressive role. So to get a sense for this, we'll go back to some things that Frank Ramsey and Quine noticed. So they both point out that an explicit instance of property talk of the form 2P on the handout, A instantiates or lacks the property of being F, can be understood without mention of any properties given a straightforward predication claim of the form 2 on the handout. A is not F. If this transformation from 2P to 2 works for all occurrences of property talk, then it would show that property talk is in fact dispensable. We don't need it. But we can show that this move doesn't work in general. To see this, consider an existential generalization on 2P, which yields a quantificational instance of property talk like 3P prime or 3P on the handout. So 3P prime is A instantiates or lacks some property, and 3P is for some property X, A instantiates or lacks X. Now, there's no nominalization of a specific predicate in 3P or 3P prime, so neither claim can be paraphrased into some explicit predication. The closest we can get to Quine and Ramsey's move from 2P to 2 for 3P prime would seem to be a move to a quantified predicate variable, what I'll call a QPV string, like 3 on the handout. But it seems that there's no way to express what 3 indicates in a natural language other than via 3P prime. Now, universal generalization poses a similar problem. Consider 4P prime on the handout. A and B instantiate all the same properties. That's a colloquial version of 4p on the handout. On the model of the transition from 3p prime to 3, 4p prime gets read as expressing 4 on the handout. Again, it seems that there's no good way to express what the QPV string 4 indicates in English other than by 4p or 4p prime. So we can see the importance of the important expressive role that property talk plays, that of providing a first-order surrogate for quantification into sentence position. Well, deflationists about property talk claim that that's the whole function of the discourse. More specifically, property talk deflationists acknowledge this expressive role, but do not accept the existence of properties if those are taken to be general entities like multiply locatable universals or something. So they usually maintain the following, which is on the handout 1 through 3. The function of property talk is not to make claims that are about properties. Its role is logically expressive, not directly descriptive. Property talk adds new logical resources into a language by providing a means for implementing higher order quantification, specifically into predicate position, within a first order logical framework, employing ordinary object variables and quantifiers. And finally, akin to truth talk, property talk enables us to capture something typically held to be inexpressible in a natural language. So as I said, property deflationists are also property nominalists. And since property nominalists don't accept properties, they need to provide a reading of 3 that doesn't commit them to properties. That makes sense. So we'll see a way of doing this soon, but I want to go back to truth talk and higher order machinery. Okay, so while the truth predicate provides a first order surrogate for the sort of higher order logical devices that are indicated in a sentence like 1, there are 2 ways to understand the relationship between truth talk and this higher order machinery. So what we're really asking is, what's the relationship between those 2 things? Way 1. Way 1 says that these logical devices serve merely to indicate, capture, or regiment, or model the logical role of the truth predicate. On this view, there is some prior account of truth talk on the table, and the logical machinery is used to illustrate some features of the discourse. So for people who are into stuff on the logic of truth and things, there are some theorists who adopt way 1. For example, Joe Diazuni and Lavinia Piccolo and Thomas Schindler have done that. Way 2, which is the way that we're going to go, says that the higher order devices serve to explain rather than merely indicating, capturing, regimenting, or modeling both the truth predicate's logical role and what the interesting instances of truth talk express. On this approach, way 2, one doesn't need a prior account of truth talk, since the aim here is to provide such an account. Okay, well, I'm going to call way 2 sentential variable deflationism, or SVD. SVD makes sentential variables and quantifiers the explanatory basis for an account of truth talk. But of course, this requires an adherence of SVD, what I'll call an SVDist, to provide a prior and, importantly, an independent account of sentential variables and quantifiers, like Gesundheit, P for all P and for some P, which is something that some philosophers have failed to do. So just to see why this is the case, let's go back to Ramsey. So Ramsey said in 1929, if sentential variables and quantifiers were in one's toolbox, then the truth predicate could be defined, and he said, in Mr. Russell's symbolism, along the lines of 5 on the handout. B is true amounts to, there's a P. B is a belief that P and P. It's a definition. Note that in introducing his form of SVD, Ramsey fails to satisfy the independence criterion. This is because he draws an inadequate analogy with Russell's account of first-order quantification. As we all know, Russell analyzed quantification in terms of predication, identity, and truth, which renders Ramsey's appeal to his account circular in the context of SVD. So this raises another question. how should an SVDist understand the higher order logical machinery? Before giving my approach, I want to reject a couple of other approaches. One approach to doing this is to take these logical devices substitutionally. So to use substitutional quantification. Substitutional quantification interprets the variables as placeholders for linguistic items from a substitution class the quantifiers provide, where these linguistic items get substituted into the variables in use positions, yielding substitution instances. Well, there are a lot of concerns about using substitutional quantification, but these concerns are specifically problematic for SVD. Depending on how these proposed substitutional devices are explained, the approach falls victim to one of two problems. The first one was identified by Paul Horich and others, and that is, like Kripke, that substitutional quantification is often explained in terms of the truth of either all or some of the substitution instances. So, like Horich says, that something like QSVD, a QSVD string like 1, is understood in terms of, quote, all the substitution instances of if the oracle said that P, then P are true, unquote. So on his view, 1 could not be used to explain truth talk in this way. And notice that this way of understanding sentential variables and quantifiers falls victim to the same problem that Ramsey had. Now, in fact, and this is kind of, I'm mentioning this because it's relevant to my project, Horich has expressed skepticism about way 2 in general. What he says is that the prospect of explaining truth in terms of any form of quantification into sentence position is problematic. And he said that the raison d'etre of our notion of truth is to enable us to do so without such quantification. Now, an alternative approach to substitutional quantification interprets it as a means for encoding infinite conjunctions or infinite disjunctions of the substitution instances. So Mary and David has talked about this. This avoids the circularity worry, but it gives rise to a second problem for this approach by raising a question about how sentential variables and quantifiers could function as a means for expressing genuine generalizations. Anil Gupta has made this point a while ago. Anyway, on either of those two interpretations, it seems like the substitutional understanding of sentential variables and quantifiers just can't be the basis of SVD. So what about doing what Jody, Azuni, and Piccolo and Schindler did, way 1? That is, what about bringing in stipulated formalisms to interpret sentential variables and quantifiers? Well, I mean, obviously, theorists are free to propose whatever technical formalisms they want when they're doing formal theorizing. But when it comes, when they're explaining some aspect of ordinary discourse, but their proposal will succeed only if 2 conditions are met. The first is that there's got to be a way of understanding the stipulated formalism, and it's got to be the case that there's no way of explaining that aspect of ordinary speech using only the resources of natural language. Well, from 1 and 2 on the handout, what we get is that if 1 can capture the sentential generalizing indicated in 1 by for all P directly in a natural language, that would provide a sufficient reason for not taking this stipulated formalism approach. And that's what I'm going to do. What I'll do is I'll explain a way of satisfying SVD's aspirations in terms of a natural language interpretation, what I call NLI, a natural language interpretation of QSV strings. And this responds to Horich's skepticism. And if I'm right, this shows that truth talk is actually dispensable. Okay, so let's jump into this. Prior understands sentential variables and quantifiers as sui generis formal machinery that functions as non-nominal adverbial logical devices. Before explaining the approach, I'll do what I said I was going to do and give a little survey of non-nominal quantification. So consider the following argument from A to the conclusion AC. when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I was very surprised by how tall Tyler Burge was. So A says, Tyler Burge is tall and so is Michael Jordan. AC, so there is something Burge and Jordan both are. Now, in AC, we're quantifying into the position of the expression tall into general, not singular term position. We therefore can't analyze AC in terms of AC asterisk. This is because AC asterisk is ill-formed. And if you want to know, like, why is AC asterisk ill-formed, consider the following. If AC asterisk was well-formed, we could substitute the x's in AC asterisk as singular terms. But B on the handout, Burge's tallness, is ungrammatical. Moreover, while AC plus is well-formed and grammatical, AC minus, and sorry, I'm not going to read all of these because you have them. AC minus is neither well-formed nor grammatical. The conclusion of this is that something in AC is a form of non-nominal quantification. So for non-nominal quantification, the quantifiers and variables don't operate on linguistic items, slotting in the members of a substitution class of these into the positions occupied by variables to form complete linguistic items as substitution instances of the strings the quantifiers prefix. Okay, so now that we've gone through that, again in my position, which I call adverbial sentential variable deflationism, or SVD, sorry for all those. And I'll start with prior because that was the kind of motivation for the position in the first place. So I'm trying to improve on prior. Prior enlists the neologisms any whether, some whether, and thither in developing his version of ASVD. These maintain a structural clarity. These maintain a structural clarity by tracking the form of a QSV string. For example, given Prior's neologisms, one gets rendered informally as 6 on the handout. For any whether, if the oracle says that thither, then thither. While 6 provides an adequate reading of 1, the problem with Prior's approach is that his neologisms provide really only an impressionistic grasp of his adverbial reading of sentential variables and quantifiers. If we really want to use these logical devices to explain, rather than merely to model, the generalizing role of truth talk, we've got to go beyond Prior's stipulated expressions. What? Whoa. Now we're too far. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've got to go beyond prior. So now we're going beyond prior. Prior suggests how to do this for a couple of QSV strings in terms of what I call how talk quantification. That's in terms of A and B on the handout. So we're going to understand for some PP in terms of things are somehow. And for all P, if she says that P, then P, in terms of however she says things are, thus they are, or that's how they are. Following Prior's appeal to Wittgenstein in the investigations, I'm going to take, quote, this is how things are, or that is how things are, as well as things are thus, to be English adverbial sentential variable expressions that are governed by the quantifiers somehow and however. The fact that it's adverbial is important for when we get to property talk. So to get a sense for how this works, to provide a non-stipulated natural language account of sentential variables and quantifiers that extends and improves on Prior's approach, let's look at an example. So consider 7 on the handout. So this is what the oracle said is true is first rendered in terms of the QSV string. This is just a reminder. For some P, P, and the oracle said that P. Now, so we go from what the oracle said is true to 7, and then we go from 7 to 7 asterisk. For somehow things are, that is how things are, and the oracle said that things are thus. That's 7 asterisk. But there's a problem with 7 asterisk. And here's the problem. Quantifying with respect to how things are should not require that there actually or always are things that are thus. But that's what 7 asterisk suggests. So taking a cue from work by Agustin Reo and Steve Yablo, I handle this issue by reading how-talk quantifiers disjunctively in terms of somehow and however some things are or are not related. Applying this to quantifiers governing sentential variables, their full forms become for however things are or are not, and that's for the universal, and for somehow things are or are not. Applying this to 7 asterisk yields 7 plus on the handout. For however things are or are not, that's how things are, and the oracle said that things are thus. Now, while this disjunctive element of how-talk quantification, when it's made explicit, what we get is that a how-talk NLI of a universal QSV string like 1 gets interpreted as 8 on the handout. For however things are or are not, if the oracle said that things are thus, then that is how they are. Or in a more colloquial and condensed form of 8, we could combine the quantifier and the antecedent of the conditional to get 8 plus. However the oracle says that things are, that is how they are. Now, if you notice, from 8 to 8 plus, we have a form of kind of absorption. And 7 plus results, so we get this form of absorption, and 7 plus, which is not there yet. Oops, I pushed one thing. Okay, 7 plus renders in its absorption variant 7 plus plus, which is on the handout. Yeah. And if you think like, well, what's this going on with this absorption? The absorption captured in these cases should be familiar from NLIs of first order quantification generally. For example, in interpreting a formula like F on the handout. F gets the English language sentence F asterisk on the handout. And that involves a form of absorption. Okay, well, consider a universal QSV string like 9 on the handout for all PP. In providing the NLI for this string, we shouldn't jump to the more colloquial, however things are, that is how things are, because that how-talk sentence actually involves absorption and is really the NLI for all P if P then P, the identity principle, which is a classical tautology. By contrast, given what 9 seems to be a string for, it seems that 9 should be possibly false, rather than being interpreted as classical tautology. Well, the NLI for 9 should therefore maintain the full disjunctive form of the how-talk quantifier expression, which gives us 9 asterisk on the handout. For however things are or not, that's how things are. And we get a condensed absorption variant of 9 asterisk like 9 plus. Things are everyhow. Now you think like everyhow, that's archaic English, by the way. It's old English. But we don't need to use everyhow, because we can instead move to 9 plus plus. Things are anyhow whatsoever, and that's English, regular English. It's clear that 9 and its absorption variants can all be understood by English speakers. None employs a neologism, even if speakers recognize that each can be false or even contradictory. Well, let's look at a couple of other examples before we move on. So let's see how the quantifiers interact with negation. To do this, look at 10, please. For some P, not P. It's not the case that P. 10 gets rendered as 10 asterisk on the handout. For somehow things are or are not, that is not how things are. And that can be condensed to 10 plus on the handout. Things are not somehow. For a more complicated case, consider a multiple mixed QSV string like 11 on the handout. Now, for all P, there is some Q such that if P and Q is identical to not P, then not Q. That receives a Hautak NLI approach along the lines of the quite long 11 asterisk, which I will not read. But that 11 asterisk captures 11. This quantification is non-nominal because the higher order sentential variables and predicate variables explained just don't function as nominal symbols, taking entities of any sort as values. As a result, the quantifiers governing them don't range over any domain of entities. And the quantification is sui generis because, as we've seen, the mode of generalizing is not to be explained in other technical terms, but instead it's to be interpreted directly in a natural language. Now, what this shows, I think, as we're going to, I'll mention this again, but is that truth talk is dispensable. But then you might get the question, so should advocates of ASVD be eliminativists about truth talk? Well, on my account, truth talk functions as a means for expressing quantification into sentence position. But it just shows that it's indispensable. It's dispensable. Truth talk is dispensable. But I don't think that we should be eliminativists about truth talk. And the reason is that adverbial Hautak quantification, and this is evidence from like 11 asterisk, is kind of clunky. It's less fine-grained and less flexible than the generalizing operation of either objective quantification or substitutional quantification. So we might hold on to truth talk with a standard domain and values mode of quantification that it allows. So we're not going to get rid of truth talk, but remember that if the Hautak approach that I've presented is successful, it still has a function because it explains both the truth predicate's logical role and what truth talk actually expresses. It's also worth noting that while ASVD does seem to avoid certain problems that confront other deflationary approaches to truth talk, it's not a cure-all that makes all the problems with truth talk that deflationists must address disappear. So, for example, and we can talk about this during the Q&A if you want, it's easy to formulate liar sentences from Hautak. And even if we just use Hautak, we still get issues regarding the conservativeness argument. Now, I apologize for a shameless plug, but if you want to see how this arises, and also what we show is that it can account for all the alethic platitudes, which some people like Crispin Wright has said kind of sink deflationism. Check out our new book that's coming out in 2 weeks. It's called The Deflationary Approach to Truth. Okay, sorry for the promotion. Okay, let's turn to property talk deflationism. So just as a brief reminder, Ramsey and Quine's observation that it seems that any transparent case of property attribution, like 2p or 2p prime, could be paraphrased into a claim that makes no explicit mention of properties, specifically a claim of the form 2 on the handout. So property talk might maintain that 2p and 2p prime say no more than what 2 says. But as we saw earlier, there was the main limitation with respect to 3p and 3p prime. Remember, there's no nominalization of a specific predicate in 3p and 3p prime. So those claims cannot be paraphrased into some explicit predication. The closest we get to Quine and Ramsey's move from 2p and 2p prime to sentence form 2 would be to move from 3p prime to a QPV string like 3 on the handout. For some p, A is not p. But given a Quinean approach to ontological commitment, that seems to thwart property nominalists' aspirations, because sentences of this form involve existential quantification over properties. And since property deflationists are generally property nominalists, They can't do it in terms of 3. Okay, well, there are other approaches to property deflationism that I'm not going to talk about here, but that we can talk about during the Q&A if people want. So for example, you might think that we can enlist Quine's class nominalism, or Arvid Bave has this error theoretic account of property talk that tries to account for property talk without accounting for accepting properties. Instead of that, and given the time constraint, I'm going to turn to my approach. So to get a good understanding of the best options available to what I think is the best option for property deflationism, for someone who wants to retain property nominalism, we've got to get a bit clearer on property talk and predicate quantification generally. Now, any deflationary account of property talk will start with a sort of transparent cases that can easily be dealt with via Ramsey's nominalistic predication paraphrase procedure, which is captured by the transformation rule in Roman numeral 1. So read the arrow in Roman numeral 1 as a sort of translation or paraphrase indicator. Just for ease, I'm going to read it as yields. And I'm not going to worry about use and mention here. Clearly, we need to be careful about that, as we're going to see. But so we read 1 as A has or lacks the property of being F, yields A is or is not F. For property deflationists, property attribution doesn't explain predication because a property-free predication is more fundamental than any transparent instance of property talk. Well, it seems to me that an adequate deflationary approach to property talk has to extend this idea to capture quantificational cases. But as we saw earlier, when discussing the expressive role of property talk, to cover those cases, a deflationary account will have to appeal to predicate variables and quantifiers employed in QPV strings. When this appeal is taken as the explanatory basis of property talk, the result is what I will call predicate variable deflationism, PVD, which runs parallel in certain ways to SVD, about truth talk. So PVD, predicate variable deflationism, yields transformation rules in the spirit of Roman numeral 1 along the lines of Roman numerals 2 through 10 on the handout. Now, I'll explain some of these to make sure that they're clear and so you kind of get the hang of it. If you want to, obviously we can discuss it later. So first consider Roman numeral 2 on the handout. A has or lacks some property, or some property is such that A has or lacks it, yields for some P, A is or is not P. So notice what I'm doing. We're going from an English language sentence to the translation that just uses higher order quantification, and not to give the punchline, but clearly we're going to go from there to a how talk version of what's on the right-hand side. So 3 has it that A has or lacks every property, or every property is such that A has or lacks it, yields for all P, A is or is not P. So let's go through the what kind of interesting ones. These are on the handout, not on the slide, until we get to 10. So you might think, so what about like the identity of indiscernibles? So what we get is 6 on the handout, Roman numeral 6. If A and B have or share all the same properties, then A is identical to B, yields for all P, if A is P, if A is P, if and only if B is P, then A and B are identical. Now, what's interesting about this is just as people can dispute the English language, the identity of indiscernibles, they can do so with its form on the right-hand side. 9 on the handout says that for every property, if A could have it, then A does have it. Yields for every P, if it's possible that A is P, then A is P. Now, you might say, wait, these seem false. I mean, unless you believe in the existence of the relevant deity. But the point is not that we're getting statements that are always true. We're just trying to see how to translate them. Okay, so let's go to Roman numeral 10 on the handout. For some property, A believes that nothing has or lacks it yields for some P, A believes that nothing is or is not P. Now, what's kind of interesting about this, the reason I wanted to mention it, is that this allows for quantification into an opaque context. So Hautak has to be able to do that too. Well, PVD comports with the idea that what property talk expresses is just what predication and quantification into predicate position expresses. That said, if we leave it as is, PVD is clearly incompatible with property nominalism because the standard reading of the QPV strings on the right-hand side sides of these rules seem to involve quantification over properties. So this wouldn't work for a property deflationist because it would seem to bring sneak properties back in through the back door. Okay, so we get a challenge for PVD. Provide an independent interpretation of the higher order logical machinery used in rules Roman numeral 2 through 10 that doesn't require a commitment to properties for those rules both to explain property talk's expressive role and to tell us what quantificational instances of property talk actually express. So let's look at that. Well, wait, okay. Okay, so rather than discussing problems, we're jumping to this. But I mentioned that it was important that our approach, SVD, involved adverbial quantification. In contrast with our approach to that higher order quantification for truth talk, I'm going to understand higher order quantification for our PVD to be adjectival. Now you might say, okay, well, is that weird or non-standard? But it's not. So I mean, consider a sentence like A is F. Like, consider something, like if you ask, A is F is an answer to the question, how is A? So you might ask, how's the salsa? The salsa is spicy. So using it adjectively does make sense. What I'm going to show is that reading quantification into predicate position adjectively allows us to appeal to another form of Hautak quantification to interpret it. And using Hautak quantifiers here is crucial because non-nominal, because it's non-nominal, and thereby avoids any commitment to properties as entities. So we looked at the two basic cases of quantification, of generalizing into predicate position, in claims of the form A is F, which gets interpreted adjectively according to the adjectival quantifier, or A rules, that we can find in Roman numerals 2, what happened? Something bad happened, I apologize. In Roman numeral 2 and A. I'm just jumping to it. Okay. So Roman numeral 2A. For some, so now we're going from the our right-hand side of what we had previously to something like 2A. For some P, A is not P yields for somehow things are or are not, that's how A is not. Alternatively, A is not thus. Now, as you're reading this or listening, you might think like, well, why don't we just do, instead of somehow, we can do some way. And for people who are familiar with this stuff, Kuhne, Wolfgang Kuhne has tried to do something like that. But first of all, Kuhne is not a property deflationist, but notice that if we did this, then this would involve quantification over ways, which would be highly problematic. Oh, no, good. Thank you. Which would be highly problematic. So you can't, we have to stick with somehow. We can't do some way. So let's look at 3a. For all p, a is not p. That yields, for however things are or are not, that's how a is or is not, or a is not thus. Well, the other rules listed on the handout, and now up there, interpret more complicated QPV strings. I'm going to consider some of them now, but we can talk about them later. So let's look at 4a, Roman numeral 4a. For all p, if a is not p, then b is not p, which yields, for however things are or are not, if that's how a is or is not, then that's how b is or is not. Or we could have, for however a is or is not, b is or is not. Since we talked about the one for the identity of indiscernibles, we'll look at that, which is Roman numeral 6a on the handout. For all p, if a is p, if and only if b is p, then a is identical to b, yields, for however things are or are not, if a is thus, if and only if b is thus, then a and b are identical. And so, I mean, what you can see is what we get on the right-hand side is false if, like, Max Black was right with his counterexample. Okay. Well, let's do 10a, last one. For some p, a believes that nothing is not p, which yields, for somehow things are or are not. That is how. So for some p, a believes that nothing is not p, yields, for somehow things are or are not, a believes that nothing is or is not thus. So notice, the reason I mentioned this one previously, is that our how talk allows us to do quantification into an intentional or an opaque context. And I mean, I take that to be a real advantage. Now, if we combine this non-nominal adjectival interpretation of predicate quantification with the PVD approach to explaining property talk in terms of predicate quantification, we get adjectival predicate variable deflationism, or, as you might now have guessed, APVD. APVD explains the meanings of the full range of property talk instances while fully comporting with property nominalism and potentially even fitting with broader contemporary forms of nominalism. But it leads to a new question. And the question is on the handout on the board. How does our treatment of property talk, APVD, manage to express something so very different from what a face value reading of property talk appears to involve, where the face value reading of property talk seems to involve nominal and objectual quantification over the very entities that property talk is supposed to be rejected according to property nominalists. Does this make it seem like our approach is unsuited for an approach to property talk? Well, James and I bridge that gap by providing a non-error theoretic semantic pretense involving fictionalist account, what we call a SPIF account, of property talk. This is related to the SPIF account of truth talk that we've developed in our other books and articles and stuff. Our SPIF account of property talk, which we're working on right now, seems to be able to accommodate the intuition behind the aforementioned face value reading of property talk. And it can do this without undermining property nominalism. And it accounts for other objections that people might have. And we can go through this during the Q&A if people want. But like, you might say, well, what about examples that seem like they involve properties but don't use the word property? Like, you know, it's something like, yeah, we can go through that. Our SPIF account accommodates that. Well, in addition, it accommodates or accounts for the intuition behind the aforementioned face value reading of prop talk. So rather than challenging our APVD approach in the question that I asked previously, the way in which we accommodate the aforementioned intuition provides, I think, an impetus for our APVD treatment of property talk. But I'm going to set that aside for the Q&A or for later. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks.
It's time for questions and comments.
Answer questions.
Okay. So I have a couple of different thoughts, but
Yeah.
I'll start with just the one. So you, as you were going through, I kind of had a bit of a hashtag response to 9++ and 10+.
Yeah.
Those are on page 4. And you're sort of gloss on those is like, oh no, those are like standard English. They're pretty comprehensible. And my thought there was like, oh well, if you just put in any way in those, that works just fine. Then you said, oh, people have tried this, and we don't want to quantify over ways.
Right.
That's problematic. So I guess I'm wondering, like, can you say a bit more about why it is more problematic to quantify over ways than hows, such that the cost of the hashtag is dealt with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the quick answer is a question. What on earth are hows? There aren't hows. I mean, but there could be ways, because you could say something like, there is a way that things are. You can't really say there is a how that things are. And so it seems like, I mean, maybe there's a way of treating way talk that doesn't involve quantifying over ways. But the approach, so the approach that Kuna does, he admits that he quantifies over ways. But it just seems like with hows, I just don't see how you can get even if, so the point is that there is a potential problem for way talk. But if you look at that potential problem, it doesn't apply to how talk. So what we'd have to do is provide a different way. Like maybe there's some way of treating how talk so we have quantifying over hows. But if it's the way how works in natural language like English, it just doesn't seem like there can be such a thing. Am I missing your concern?
I would have thought that quantifying over how is like, I would naturally interpret a how as like a situation in the way that it's being used here. Like,
Right,
how,
away.
How are these arranged? Well, you give me a grid and I'll put the like points on the grid, which like this thing is and this thing is, and that's a how.
But doesn't it, but even the way you described, I'm sorry. Even the way you described it, you made it seem like it's going from hows to ways. That's a way that things might be.
Yeah, I guess I'm, as far as like giving like I kind of agree, and then my thought is like, how are you avoiding the slide from hows to ways in the like metaphysics
Right.
here, given the naturalness of way talk over how talk?
Well, I mean, so I guess, I mean, it seems to me that really that's a challenge if we have some independent reason for thinking that we can quantify over hows. But I just don't see that. I was going to say I don't see how, but I was resisting that.
Well, let me give you 3 different hows.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate that question. But I mean, that really is something that we've been, I mean, we were going by what Kuna, and Kuna's retracted the way talk, by the way. Yeah. Yeah.
Raimundo, please. I'll start with a comment. It's a very medieval talk. The universals strike again.
Right.
But on one hand, you seem to pay homage to Ockham and try to see how free can we be from commitments. And on the other hand, you seem to go beyond and say, we're not going to be talking about hypostasis, we're not going to be talking about even language. We want to go further.
Right.
But I share some of the worries with Kat. Are we really talking about configurations? How the word is? How can we cash it out in a way that
Right.
we avoid the previous pitfalls?
Right. Right. So my hope with respect to this was that being non-nominal, we're not quantifying over hows. But what I see your very good question, or really challenge, as being to go further and try and give an interpretation of this how talk. And just putting my cards on the table, my thought was that as long as we can give conversions into something that uses natural language, we don't really have to deal with the metaphysics. But I see what you're saying as being, well, maybe you do have to worry about the metaphysics. And I think that's a very good point that, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it seems like maybe more needs to be said about how we're interpreting this how talk. I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, but I guess a question. So, I mean, do you think, if you, let's say that you grant that these transitions into the kind of natural language variants using how talk just is a part of natural language, I mean, does that provide us with a reason for not having to give a further analysis? Or do you think that it doesn't? We still have to explain how to interpret it in different ways. I mean, because in a sense, what you're asking is, I've said we can explain this in terms of natural language, and you're saying now I need. You're not saying I don't understand. You're saying I want to understand how this natural language part is being understood. And I guess the question I have to think about whether that's really a challenge. Is it really a challenge? I mean, we're not quantifying over anything weird. It's adjectival, so we're not talking about things in when we're using how talk. But do you think that?
I don't see it as a challenge. I think you're on the right path.
Okay.
But let's avoid all these posts
Yeah.
that we still want to understand better
Yeah.
without committing to those ontological assumptions.
Right. But I appreciate that. But so and I really appreciate that, because what I was thinking was, so you asked the question, how do we understand it better? Well, if we can present it in a sentence that's in a language that we all understand, then that's exactly what more do we need to do?
I distrust language.
Well, I agree with you on that. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Okay, a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Pretty fast, I hope. You also said that you want to explain anyhow and however and somehow disjunctively, right?
Yeah.
But then aren't you going to need something like how's it called? Exclusionary exhaustivity condition, so that it's not just that this way or the actual natural language sentence or this other way, well, not way, this sentence or this other sentence, but then you're gonna have to need something like, and those are the only ways there are, and otherwise you're not gonna get the desired truth conditions, and that is going to be quantified, disjunct or conjunct actually, that you may, you're not going to be able to then nominalize later because it's.
So, is there a particular example that I understand what you're saying? That's interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, like any of the the identity of indiscernibles, right?
Yeah.
You can. It is not just that it has all the truths that involve A and all the truths that involve B have the same predicates, but that there are no further predicates that in which they can differ, because in other possible worlds you may have other different truths.
That's certainly true. But so I just have a question.
Yes.
So the fact that we didn't modalize it, does that kind of block that objection, or do you think the objection rearises, or maybe what you're saying is you could just come up with a sentence like that one that does bring in modality, and then you couldn't do it in the way that we're saying? I mean, is that kind of what you're pointing to?
So you would need however things could be, or something like that, so that you would need to have a disjunction of all the also possible ones and be able to somehow distinguish them from the actual ones.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would probably work. But
Okay.
yeah, because the problem commonly arises.
Right, I know
moduli.
that's right, yeah, I appreciate that, but yeah, I think that might work.
Okay, then second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I know there's little time.
No, go ahead.
Because this is also a continuation on Kat's point. Because if you're right and going from any way to any high works, wouldn't somebody be able to say something similar from any place to anywhere and therefore just nominalize places very easily? And I don't know if we want that, right?
Right, well, I don't need to, yeah, well, I do think that would be a problem.
Yeah.
But I guess so what I'm thinking about with respect to that question is just that we're not trying to give accounts of all of that kind of quantification. We're trying to account for property talk using it. So, I mean, I bet you're right. I bet that if there was a reason for having to bring that in, then we might have to quantify over those things. But I'm not seeing a reason why we would have to do that. So I guess it's a challenge against me to show that here are cases that require us to do that. If there are, then that might be problematic. But I don't see them yet.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. John, please.
Yeah, first of all, just a question how far you want to push this, and then I have a harder question maybe.
Okay.
So this is a great for sentential quantification and quantification to predicate position.
Yeah.
So it gives an English paraphrase for that.
Right.
But how high up the type theoretical hierarchy do you think you can find paraphrases here? So I'm already at like quantification into relation position. It's not clear to me how much we have English paraphrases for this.
Right.
This is not a criticism, just like.
I understand. No, I appreciate that. Yeah.
yes.
Well, I mean, I guess the question that I would have for that is whether there's a reason for having to extend higher. So is there something, when you go up to those levels, are there expressive roles that can't be accounted for given certain prior assumptions or desires like property nominalism? If there are, then you're 100% right that we have to go higher. But I would have to think about whether there are. Maybe that's the hard question, that there are, which would be good. But I think my response to the not hard question, to the first question, is that that would be true. We would have to do that only if there's an expressive role that can only be accommodated in English using some predicate that seems problematic from the perspective, or like either ways of cashing out statements of truth talk or being committed to properties. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds fair. I should come
Yeah.
up with some examples too.
Okay.
But the other question was like you mentioned like the various problems with truth that don't go away.
Yeah.
Because you have wire-like things. So I was just going to ask you as an annoying question. I'm sure you thought about
Good.
that. So the Kaplan-Prior paradox.
Yeah.
So suppose the only thing Kaplan says at midnight
Yeah.
is that I'm going to try to do it in your lingo here. However things are, if Kaplan says that they are thus at midnight, then they are not thus.
Right.
And then classically you can prove that then he says something
Yeah,
true
that's a good
and
one.
something false, right? So
Yeah.
what do you think is the right way of thinking about these cases?
Well, so now here is a very annoying response. You have to buy our book, or at least illegally download it somehow, because we address exactly that. I mean, part of what we did in a previous book is to give a particular account to that paradox and all of the semantic paradoxes using it's in principle separate from our pretense account, but we do incorporate it in our pretense account and address that, so that even if we put that into how talk, what we would claim is that, so just like what we say to the liar sentences, is that they actually lack, we have an account of how we understand content for which those lack any.
Can I ask you quickly
Anything.
about this? So since this, you can give a version of the Kaplan-Prior thing purely in the how talk.
Yeah.
So what's roughly is the story of why this doesn't express something? Because it seems to be, there's an issue about like Kaplan sets at midnight.
I know.
So that's the hard part, perhaps.
Yeah,
But,
it
like,
is.
everything else looks purely logical. So
Right.
now you feel like, okay, what's going on?
Right.
But yeah, so what's the story? Why? Roughly.
Yeah. I mean, so
And then I'll buy the book.
no. Or I'll send you. How about I'll send you the book. These are good. These are good and also challenging. So we have not. We've addressed the Kaplan Montague kind of cases, but we haven't applied it to how talk. So I mean, I could. I hope that, and that's a good thing for me to do. We have to do that. But we did it just in terms of just natural language without bringing in how talk. But I do see that as something that we have to do, and I appreciate that because we haven't done that yet. Thank you, and that is a hard question, so thank you. You were right.
Thanks. Anyone else? Garb, please.
This is a different question. It's
I'm sorry, only one question per person. Go for it.
And this is one of those, like, I think this is sort of an everybody's problem
Yeah.
question, so I'm not asking you to solve this, I'm asking just
That's no
sort
good.
of your thoughts on it. So I think kind of whenever we're doing philosophy of language type work, there's this question about like how much are we doing philosophy of English or philosophy of language?
Right.
And I'm particularly interested in that in this case, with respect to like A star C
Yeah.
and B.
Yeah.
And in like a lot of these cases, but like English likes to use is when it's doing predication. But like if I were saying I am 39 in Spanish, I wouldn't use is, right? I would
Right.
use have.
Right.
And that seems like a lot less problematic in this particular set of examples. Like, am I having X number of years? Doesn't seem ill-formed grammatically, right? Like, that's grammatically fine.
Right.
I have it, and somebody else has it, and there's no problem with that.
Right.
Whereas, like, my being,
Right.
the thing of 39, like,
Right.
what in the world does that mean?
Right.
And so I'm kind of wondering, like, how much the work you're doing here is a story about predication in English, or how much is it a story about predication in general? How much do you care?
No. Well, I think that's a great question. How much I care is, since I hadn't thought about it previously, I now care about it a lot. I mean, what I was thinking was that the challenge is to do it in some natural language. Now, maybe we could see what you're asking, not as a question as to whether, does this apply to, I mean, do you intend this to apply to all languages, which is kind of your question.
Yeah.
But rather the question, does this apply to all languages? And if it doesn't apply to a particular language, is that problematic?
Yeah, like what do you?
I mean, does that seem right? Yeah, and well, let me ask you a question. So, I mean, suppose that you've got something that you want to represent in some, using some logical language, and you can adequately represent it using like first order logic. But there are other logical languages, for which it initially it seems kind of weird, and maybe you can't do it in those other languages, logical languages. Would you think, does that pose a problem if you had to be able to regiment it in a natural language? You say, here it is, and the person says, well, okay, that works, but I actually also like this other logic, and I'm not sure if it translates into that logical language. Like, would that pose a problem?
No, I mean, I think it would depend on like what the thing I'm trying to do with that particular regimentation is, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's a matter of giving the one true regimentation, then it's a big problem for me.
Yeah.
But if it's a matter of giving a satisfactory regimentation, then it's not a problem.
Right.
And so I think the question for this case is like, do you want for this to be two interesting accounts of deflation? Or do you want this to be, whenever we're engaging in predication, in fact, this is what's happening regardless of who's doing the predication?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, what I was thinking, and I guess what I'm still inclined to think, is that with respect to something like this, I mean, it's sort of like if you're doing Quinean regimentation and you give a particular regimentation, someone says, but look, there's another regimentation and that commits you to property, to entities you didn't want. You'd say like, well, that just shows that that's not the one we want to use. I guess I thought that the challenge is to provide some way of representing these things. And if you can do that, then you've got it, rather than for any language. So, but I think it's a good question. I mean, I don't know if it would be a problem if you couldn't translate it into Spanish, using Spanish or some other language. I think that's a good question. But I guess I think that I'd have to figure out why we have to do that.
Yeah, like, I think it would be a super interesting result if it were like, hey, English speakers predicate actually super differently from speakers
Right.
of this language or that
Right.
language. Like the
Right.
metaphysically what they're doing is different.
Right.
Like
I
that's a
agree.
really interesting.
It's fascinating. Like with Chinese, they don't have the definite article.
Yeah.
I think that's it's very interesting how
it's
they,
not impossible.
right, it's right, but how they can express the same things that we express without using definite articles. It's interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Please.
About this, you might remember that beautiful Borges tale,
Oh, yeah.
Surrounded by all his statues.
Yes.
No predicates because we don't even have nouns.
Yeah. I was thinking about that last
I
night.
think that pushes the cat's point even further.
It does. I was thinking about that. So you know, last night I was thinking, I want to mention the Borges story. And I forgot. I'm so glad you mentioned that. I love that story. And it's so apropos of this. You're exactly right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for, yeah.
Anyone else? So, well, I will ask.
Go ahead.
You know, for some people, properties and sets and collections and stuff like that are closely connected, so to speak. And I was wondering about your take on sets and collections. And would you say that collection also plays an expressive role, or sets and collections are different beasts to be treated differently?
Right. I think that's a great question. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to work on, is whether set talk, whether it has an expressive role. And if it does have an expressive role, then at least for the general account to work, there's got to be a way of expressing it without quantifying over it, without being committed to those entities. But for purposes of this position, I just was going with property nominalism. But I agree with you. I mean, I think that's a challenge to all deflationists. Like if there's an expressive role for it, and it seems like it commits you to things that maybe you didn't want to commit to, then you've got to be able to explain how the expressive role gets conveyed without that kind of ontological commitment. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. But I don't, and so for the purpose of this, we thought property nominalism. I mean, I think that, Quine and Goodman both recognize that their nominalism could only go so far. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. Let's.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks for the great questions.
And thanks to Brad, we